For years, Linux's phones felt like a joke, a developer toy, or a niche experiment. Something only hardcore open-source fans cared about. Meanwhile, Android and iOS completely dominated the world. But here's the question nobody is asking loudly enough. What if that dominance isn't as untouchable as it looks? Because in 2026, Linux phones are no longer just concepts. They're real, they're usable. For the first time, they're starting to feel like serious alternatives. Not perfect, not mainstream, but serious. Let's be honest. Smartphones today feel powerful, but also locked down. You don't really own your device. You rent your ecosystem. Your data syncs to someone else's cloud. Your apps depend on corporate approval. Your updates stop when the manufacturer decides. Most people accept this because they think there's no real alternative. But what if there is? Linux-based mobile operating systems like Ubuntu Touch, postmarketOS, and Sailfish OS are quietly evolving. They're becoming smoother, more polished, more stable, most importantly, more usable for everyday tasks. That changes everything. For years, the biggest problem with Linux phones wasn't vision. It was practicality. Battery life wasn't great, app support was limited, hardware compatibility was messy, performance was inconsistent. But progress has been steady, and something interesting is happening. As more people become frustrated with tracking, forced updates, subscription ecosystems, and limited device lifespans, the appeal of open-source mobile platforms is growing. Let's talk about ownership. When you buy a typical smartphone today, you don't really control it. The bootloader might be locked. The operating system might prevent deep customization. System-level changes are restricted. Even replacing the OS can be complicated or blocked entirely. With Linux phones, that dynamic shifts. You can install the OS you want. You can modify it. You can update it independently of a manufacturer's timeline. You can keep a device alive far longer than the typical 3 to 4 year cycle. That's powerful. And in a world where planned obsolescence feels normal, longevity becomes a selling point. Then there's privacy. Android and iOS both collect data in different ways at different levels, but both are tightly connected to large corporate ecosystems. Linux mobile platforms don't depend on that model. No mandatory Google account, no Apple ID requirement, no background data collection tied to advertising networks. That doesn't mean Linux phones are magically private out of the box. Privacy still depends on how you use the device, but the architecture allows for deeper control. And control is what many tech-aware users are starting to value again. Now let's address the big elephant in the room, apps. Because no matter how open or private a platform is, if it doesn't support daily apps, messaging, maps, email, social media, it struggles to survive. This is where Linux phones used to fall apart, but now there are creative solutions. Web apps have improved. Compatibility layers exist. Some platforms allow Android app support through container systems. It's not perfect, but it's no longer impossible. And that shift from unusable to imperfect but functional is massive. Because revolutions don't happen when something is flawless. They happen when something becomes good enough. Android once looked rough compared to early iPhones. Now it dominates globally. Could Linux phones follow a similar path? Be not at the same scale? But the momentum is real. Developers are paying attention. Privacy advocates are paying attention. Even hardware companies are experimenting with open platforms. The question isn't whether Linux phones can replace Android and iOS overnight. It can't. The real question is, what happens if they keep improving at this pace? Because if Linux phones become stable, practical, and easy enough for everyday users, that's when Android and iOS might have something to worry about. And we're just getting started. Now let's talk about what's actually changing in 2026, because the idea of a Linux phone isn't new. What's new is maturity. Platforms like Ubuntu Touch, postmarketOS, and Sailfish OS aren't just booting on a handful of old devices anymore. They're becoming more stable, more polished, and more focused on real-world use. Take Ubuntu Touch, for example. It's built around convergence, the idea that your phone can become a desktop when connected to a monitor. That's something Android and iOS talk about in limited ways, but Linux platforms have been experimenting with this concept for years. Plug in a keyboard and monitor, and your phone can act like a lightweight Linux desktop. That's powerful. Then there's postmarketOS. Its mission is long-term support. Instead of abandoning phones after a few years, postmarketOS aims to keep devices running for a decade or more. Let's think about that. Most smartphones today stop receiving updates after 3 to 5 years. But a Linux-based system isn't tied to a manufacturer's schedule. As long as the hardware works, the software can evolve. That flips the business model on its head, because modern smartphone ecosystems are built around replacement cycles. Linux phones challenge that. And then there's Sailfish OS. It blends a polished interface with open foundations. It's one of the more consumer-friendly Linux mobile platforms, focusing on smooth gestures and practical daily usability. None of these platforms are perfect, but they're no longer experiments. Now let's talk about performance. Modern mobile processors are incredibly powerful. Even mid-range chips can handle multitasking, browsing, streaming, and productivity apps easily. Linux mobile systems are starting to take advantage of that power more efficiently. Without heavy background services, aggressive telemetry, and constant sync processes, a lightweight Linux OS can feel surprisingly responsive. And here's where things get interesting. As AI features expand in Android and iOS, real-time cloud processing, predictive services, integrated assistance, more computation happens remotely. That's convenient. But it also increases dependency on centralized infrastructure. Linux phones lean in the opposite direction. They prioritize local control. Not because AI is bad, but because decentralization matters to their philosophy. Now let's address the ecosystem problem honestly. Android and iOS dominate because of their app stores. Millions of apps, seamless payments, tight integration, massive developer support. Linux phones don't compete on volume. They compete on openness. Instead of one centralized store controlling everything, Linux platforms allow flexible app sources. You can install from repositories. You can load. You can even build your own apps directly on the device. That level of freedom won't appeal to everyone. But for certain users, developers, privacy-focused individuals, digital minimalists, it's incredibly attractive. Another important factor is hardware experimentation. Some manufacturers are now designing devices specifically for Linux mobile systems. It's not just ported support, but intentional compatibility. That's a huge shift from the early days, when Linux phones relied on reverse engineering drivers from Android firmware. When hardware and software are designed together with openness in mind, stability improves dramatically. That's what's starting to happen. Now, does this mean Android and iOS are in danger tomorrow? No. They still dominate market share. They still control app ecosystems. They still benefit from enormous marketing budgets. But disruption rarely starts at the top. It starts quietly. It starts with niche communities. It grows through steady iteration. It gains traction as dissatisfaction rises. And dissatisfaction is rising. Subscription fatigue. Data tracking concerns. Short device lifespans. Limited customization. Linux phones aren't promising perfection. They're promising control. And that difference might matter more in the coming years than most people expect. But there's one final piece to this story, and it's the most important one. Because the future of Linux phones doesn't just depend on technology. It depends on mindset. So here's the real question. Are Linux phones trying to beat Android and iOS? Or are they trying to redefine what a smartphone should be? Because those are two very different goals. If the goal is market domination, Linux phones have a long road ahead. Android and iOS control the app ecosystem, the hardware partnerships, the advertising pipelines, and the global distribution channels. That kind of dominance doesn't disappear overnight. But if the goal is redefining ownership, privacy, and longevity, then Linux phones are already doing something powerful. They're reminding people that smartphones don't have to be locked ecosystems. They don't have to be tied to a single app store. They don't have to be replaced every few years. They don't have to send data back to massive corporate servers just to function. And that idea alone is disruptive. Let's talk about mindset. Most people today treat their phones as disposable. After 3 or 4 years, performance slows down, updates stop, or battery life fades, and the upgrade cycle begins again. Linux-based mobile platforms challenge that culture. They ask a different question. What if your phone could last as long as your laptop? What if updates weren't controlled by a manufacturer's marketing plan? What if you could swap operating systems the same way you swap Linux distributions on a PC? That level of flexibility changes the power dynamic between users and companies. It shifts control back to the individual. Now, will Linux phones ever replace Android and iOS completely? Probably not in the near future. But they don't need to. Even a small but steady user base can create pressure. Pressure for better privacy standards. Pressure for longer software support. Pressure for more user control. Competition doesn't have to dominate to influence. We've seen this before in desktop computing. Linux never overtook Windows in market share, but it pushed innovation. It influenced server infrastructure. It shaped development environments. And today, even Microsoft actively supports Linux. The same dynamic could happen in mobile. If Linux phones continue improving smoother interfaces, better hardware support, stronger app compatibility, they don't need 50% market share to matter. They just need enough traction to be taken seriously. And in 2026, for the first time, that feels realistic. The hardware is stronger, the software is more polished, the community is more organized, the demand for privacy is louder. The biggest challenge now isn't capability, it's awareness. Most people still don't know Linux phones are viable options. They assume it's complicated. They assume apps won't work. They assume it's only for developers. But assumptions change when real products improve, and improvement is happening. The Linux phone revolution won't look like a sudden explosion. It will look like steady progress, one device at a time, one update at a time, one curious user at a time. Android and iOS aren't collapsing tomorrow, but they are being watched. And for the first time in years, there's a visible alternative growing outside their ecosystem. Not louder, not flashier, but freer. And in a world where technology feels increasingly controlled, that freedom might be exactly what some users have been waiting for.